Hey guys, it's Ellen, the Mediocre Homesteader. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is my 7 biggest cooking tips, and these tips I use almost every single time I cook, and it really has just helped me become a better cook. I used to not be as good of a cook. It came with a lot of trial and error and making mistakes and just learning as I go. But I wanted to make this video and also have a blog post to accompany this video if you want to read about it instead. But I wanted to make this video to help you if you are like maybe not as good of a cook, or you don't think you're a good cook and you want to get better. So let's dive into my tips. So tip number 1 is to season your food in layers. And what I mean by this is, let's say you're making a chicken pot pie. This is something I make all the time. And the first step to this is to saute vegetables, and they are raw vegetables, so they don't have like any salt or pepper in them, unlike maybe something you get in a can. So I will salt and pepper that to start, and I'll also fry them in some butter, and butter also gives a lot of flavor as well. And that is like the first layer, for instance. And then the next step might be to add in some chicken broth or in the chicken. And then I again would put salt and pepper on that to give that next layer some seasoning. I was watching a cooking show and they were talking about how salt and pepper really like draws out the flavor in the food, and like seasonings like garlic powder, onion powder, or oregano, Italian seasoning, those things give it flavor, but the salt and pepper like draws out the flavor so you taste it more. And I was like, wow, that makes so much sense, and even more of reiterating my philosophy on seasoning in layers. If I'm cooking raw meat or raw beef or venison, I will season it raw, and then when it's cooked I'll season it again with salt and pepper or whatever seasoning I'm using, and it just like gives it so much more depth of flavor and makes it taste better. Tip number 2 is to have a dump container next to you if you are using raw vegetables. I almost am always chopping up vegetables, and on vegetables there are certain parts that you don't always use, like the end of an onion or the end of a carrot, and that sort of thing I will just put in the dump container right next to me as I'm cooking, so I don't have to keep running back and forth to the trash can, and it just makes my life easier, and it also makes it easy for throwing in the compost bin when I am done. Tip number 3 is to use fresh herbs. Now, I didn't realize how important this tip was until just a few years ago, and I started experimenting with fresh herbs. I just started with buying them from the store and adding them into the food, and it just does something to the food. It makes it taste so much more fresh, and it just tastes so much better than dried seasoning. Now, dried seasoning is great. I use it all the time. You can't always use fresh herbs. I mostly use fresh herbs in the summertime when they're growing out in the garden. But herbs are super easy to grow. So even if you live in an apartment, you can get a grow light and have fresh herbs all year round if you wanted. They're so easy. They really just up level your cooking. 4th tip is to taste as you go. Now, this might be common sense to you, but some people don't taste their food as they go. If you're making a sauce, taste it. See if it needs more salt, more pepper, or whatever seasoning that is going into it. And if you are cooking pasta, try it before you take it out of the pot and see if it is the texture of your liking. And yeah, just taste your food as you go. There is an old saying that goes, never trust a skinny cook, which I don't really believe, but it was implying to taste your food while you're cooking it, to make sure that it's good along every step. Tip number 5 is to use multiple dishes if that is going to make the dish better. Like, for example, there's this chicken sausage pasta that I like to make, and I always saute the vegetables first because I'm using an already pre-cooked chicken. And so I'll saute the vegetables first because those usually take longer. And then I will dump out the vegetables into a bowl so they stop cooking because they're already like perfectly cooked. And then I'll like cut up the chicken, add it into the pot and saute that. And then I'll combine it at the end. Now, if you were a lazy cook, you would just keep the vegetables in there and add in the chicken and do it that way, but then your vegetables would be overcooked. So you kind of get what I'm saying here. So if it's going to make the dish better, just use an extra bowl. You're gonna have to wash that extra dish, but just don't be lazy and use an extra dish if you need to. One thing I also like to do when I cook is use lots of sauces. I like to make sauces, and making sauces requires a separate bowl to mix all the ingredients in, or even like bringing out the blender or the food processor to make sure that the texture is nice. And you might think when you're cooking, oh, I don't want to do that because it's just an extra step and extra dishes, but if it's really gonna make the dish taste so much better, it is worth it. I promise. Tip number 6 is to clean up as you go. Wash the dishes as you go. There are lots of meals out there, honestly, dare I say most meals that require some sort of time where the food is just sitting in a pot, or it needs to saute for 5 minutes, or needs to go into the oven. So during that time, clean up the mess you've made, put away stuff in the fridge that you are done with, just clean up as you go. In my household, I am the cooker and my husband usually washes the dishes, but I don't let that stop me from washing dishes as I go, because I don't want to leave it all for him and have this giant mess. I am the kind of person who gets overwhelmed and overstimulated when there's just a lot of mess around me. So cleaning it up as I go just makes it a lot better for me. It makes it better for my husband. So that's just what I do while I'm waiting for something to finish cooking. Tip number 7, and this is my final tip that I have for you today, is if you are following a recipe, read the whole entire recipe the day before. Now, the reason I have this in here is because if you're a newer cook, you're most likely following a recipe, and some recipes call for some things that might be really unexpected. Especially if you're cooking from scratch. Like, I have made a recipe before that calls for sourdough something or the other, and it calls for long fermentation, like 8 to 10 hours. And I didn't start that the night before, so it didn't have time to long ferment. I wasn't able to make that day. Or there's another instance where if something has an egg in it, for example, and it calls for a room temperature egg, and you're like, oh crap, I didn't set an egg out on the counter 2 hours ago, but that's like an imperative step into this recipe. That's also something that you should watch out for. Or, I mean, this is super obvious, but like if you are missing an ingredient in the recipe, there's been so many times where I'm following a recipe and I think that I have all the ingredients, but I missed one, and it's like a really crucial ingredient that can't go without in the dish, and have to run to the store in the middle of me cooking this or starting the process of cooking it. So just read the whole entire recipe through and your life will be so much easier doing this. That's definitely a mistake that I have made in my cooking years and journey. So yes, that is why it's on this list. Now, I'm not gonna put these in the blog post because they're not really like cooking tips. It's kind of just an opinion of mine that I have. But I'm going to give it in here as a bonus tip. And those bonus tips are, number 1, cook from scratch. Everything tastes better from scratch. Using raw vegetables, fresh herbs, taking the extra 20 minutes to make something homemade like biscuits or bread, it just makes it so much better. One thing I've also been doing recently is making homemade mayonnaise. And I don't use mayonnaise that much, but it's so good, and I'll put it in tuna salad, chicken salad, topping burgers with it. and it's so much better than store-bought mayonnaise in my opinion. Also, making things from scratch can be so much cheaper. People have this weird stigma that eating healthy and cooking from scratch is expensive, but it's actually not. If you look at the prices of raw fruits and vegetables at the store, they are actually so much cheaper than the processed things. Like, I really love those Bob Evans mashed potatoes. Aldi sells them, or honestly anywhere sells them, but they're like $8 for the little thing that only feeds Danny and myself. So that's really expensive, whereas a bag of potatoes is probably like $4, and you can just boil them in a pot, throw some milk and butter in there and mash them together, and it's better tasting, it's cheaper. So just little things like that that make your cooking so much better when you're cooking from scratch. And my second bonus tip, it's kind of silly, but cook with sourdough. I used to think I didn't like sourdough because I would get it from the store where they sneak in commercialized yeast in there with you don't even know if you don't read the ingredients list, but it still has like a yeasty taste, and you think that's what sourdough tastes like, but it's not actually what sourdough tastes like. And you can use sourdough starter for so much more than just baking bread. You can use it for desserts, and I make this sourdough skillet with like a bread topping on top of it. That's amazing. And sourdough just has like a rich depth of flavor that you can't get from traditional yeast. So cook with sourdough. I have a video on how to make sourdough starter yourself. It's so easy to maintain and start. So yeah, that is my bonus tips. But I really hope you guys enjoyed these tips. I'm sure I could think of way more tips for you guys, but I'm just leaving you with those today. So let me know below which tip was your favorite and which one you're going to be trying out from now on. I hope you guys can up-level your cooking with these cooking tips. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.